Hey everybody, welcome to Sons of Thunder podcast. We are your hosts, Seouljyu.
Yeah, and it's your boy Jermz, you know?
And just wanted to let you guys know the reason why we have this podcast going, the Sons of Thunder, is because we are two men of God. We are we feel called that God has brought us here to be, leaders for men. And one of the ways that we could show our leadership is through encouraging you through our experiences, and it could be specifically men's health, mental health, or just sharing different things that we learn in the professional and personal world. And we're so glad to have you. And essentially, today we're going to talk about a number of different things, but we're very excited to just share life with you, and we really appreciate you joining on. So with that said, we're talking a lot about professional and climbing the corporate ladder. So, Jermz, what are your thoughts on being a successful man? And we all understand that, as a man nowadays, in general, success is almost mandatory and it's very hyper competitive. So, what would you say are some tips that you would give people?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, I work for a big corporate bank, and I think just being in banking for such a long time, you learn a lot about the work environment and like just a corporate lifestyle. One of the things that I realized kind of early on was that a lot of people, like if you're someone who's very motivated, you're not going to find a lot of people like you unless they're kind of in management or in upper management. Because I've noticed that the average person that you work with, they are pretty much giving up their minimum. Their minimum effort is average. And I would say like that's where you kind of have to set the bar. A lot of people aren't the first people to raise their hands for projects. They kind of want to skate through with just doing the minimum, doing their job, clocking out, and just spending their time outside of work. I think one thing that I've realized and what has pushed me is just to be a problem solver, right? That's one of the key things is once you're a problem solver, you're really hard to get rid of because you're always like, hey, whenever there's an issue, I want to be a part of the solution. And they recognize that a lot. And when I mean them, it's, like people who are your managers, your mentors, they realize that shows a lot of your potential.
Right. But so you mentioned problem solver, and I agree with you, but there's some things that there's targeted problem solving, right? Because you can't solve everyone's problem or else you're going to be doing everyone else's job. Yeah. So what are some key things that you like doing that would essentially elevate your position, but also solve a lot of problems and help the company and your team?
I think a lot of it is just like thinking outside the box. You have to be very open-minded because once you get, one of the things that's hard as to when you start to just build certain routines and you kind of go through the day in and day out and just do your job, you don't really realize how else you can help unless you're networking with people. So I would say that's another thing that's a key element is, and when I say networking, it's not just socializing. It's like proactively taking that approach to reach out to somebody and say, hey, I know that you're part of the development team, or you're part of, a different team that's putting some products together. You just getting involved in there, it will create a more well-rounded person for you, so that you're able to whatever tasks may come up, you know a little bit about everything, which will help you create better solutions for your team.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you sent me a TikTok before, and I thought it was super genius. The guy was talking about, how do you become successful? How do you climb the corporate ladder? And his thesis was, if you already take on the role of the promotion that you want and you take the workload off and you assume that position without the title, that is one of the fastest ways that you could get that promotion that you're looking for. Yeah. And that made so much more sense to me because that's a lot more realistic than say, I did all my MBOs or I did my full KPIs, I deserve a raise. It's like, rather than having an agenda in your mind, if you already assume the role as, say, your manager's position or someone that's a team lead and you already do that responsibility, that is carte blanche right then and there. I've done the role for 6 months already.
Yeah.
No one else could argue that you've earned that job.
Yeah. And I think one of the misconceptions, I agree with you to the point where you should be doing that job before you get there. But there's also another piece to it that's very important is you don't have to know 100% of the role before you jump into that role. As like, if you're looking for a management role and you're trying to get there, even if you know 50% of it, you can learn the next 50% during the job too. It's just going to take more on you when you get there to reach out to people that you trust that can help you learn the role, and just people who are on those teams and getting up to speed. But there's nothing wrong with just saying, hey, like, I want to take on this role and I'm going to challenge myself to be successful in it. And so that's one thing that a mentor at my work has told me. And he was, and also one of the things I do want to touch upon is sometimes you're not the best at assessing yourself, right? Like sometimes we're our own we're the harshest critic for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because I had a scenario when I was talking to someone that I trust, one of our managers, and he was like, what's your aspirations? Like, what's your goals? And it was just it wasn't like a annual review or anything like that. It was just more like, hey, it's just a conversation. And I was like, yeah, this is where I want to be in your seat. Like I want to be where you are because, this is the level that I want to be. These are the decisions I wanted to make. And I felt like that was like a good answer, and he looked at me and he was like, dude, I've known you since you got here, and I've seen the way that you move through the office, and the way that you kind of treat everybody, and then also the way that you do your work. I've seen your work. So why don't you want to be a regional manager? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, geez, I never thought of it like that. Mm-hmm. Like I've never been pushed to that point where I'm like, hey, I basically want to go out and get the world. Mm-hmm. And then, it's like what do they say? Like if you shoot for the moon, you'll fall on the stars or something like that, like that kind of saying where it's like, you want to go for it and you shouldn't limit yourself to to certain positions because you can definitely achieve more and other people will see that in you.
Exactly. So that's my goal in terms of not regional manager, but I want to be part of the executive board team. Mm-hmm. And, it's incredibly insane to me that companies, whether it be JP Morgan Chase or you're talking about a startup or just any company, you would literally have to drop 15 to 30 minutes of your time on an all hands call to listen to your CEO talk about some stuff that honestly may or may not help. But it's insane to me that everyone's in this agreement that this one person or two people or whoever's on the meeting agenda, I must drop everything to listen to what this person has to say. Yeah. They are that important. For me, instead of wearing the lanyard, scanning into the office, I want to be the guy where I'm set up from 8 to 8:30 a.m. all hands meeting. Whatever I have to say, everyone has to stop and listen to whatever thing I have to say. And most often than not, it's going to be some kind of rah-rah speech that really wouldn't matter. But what's interesting is that you have this part of your personality. I don't have it. I'm a natural introvert. So I really, for lack of a better term, don't really socialize if I don't need to socialize. But you are, in my opinion, I would say the mayor or wherever you are. And it starts with you always just being curious and you just want to get to know people genuinely. I lack that kind of thing. So, you shared with me a story where, and I think it's incredibly smart, that Jermz over here was like on an elevator. Was it the CEO or who was it?
No, this was like a managing director on the sales side. Yeah.
Yeah. So managing director, for those who don't know, what would that be equivalent to?
I would say maybe a vice president at a firm. I know in banking it's a little bit different
because everyone's a vice president.
Yeah, because what I was told was that in banking, you usually go through as an associate to vice president and then executive director. So and then it goes to more and more directors. But I I heard in other corporations, it's actually flipped. So it's like you go as a director
Yep.
and then you become vice president. So that's why I say like a president, vice president, like ish.
Yeah. Okay. So, a highly powerful individual, and they're in an elevator. Most of people that were his level, or maybe a little below, were just so kind of starstruck and didn't want to say anything, but just was like whispering, like, "That's managing director."
Yeah.
And Jermz literally just remembered his last conversation, and he said, "How's your daughter? How is she doing in USC?" Right?
Yeah. So like just to that point, I want to dig deep on that because it's a very, very important thing to do, especially when you're in a corporation, right? I think for me, and we'll go into this more about, what your skill is and what your talents are. And I think for me, like one thing I identified is my relationship building skills are one of my strengths, right? So for me, it just comes naturally. Like I try not to focus on the work piece as much because your work kind of speaks for itself, right? If you have like a brand or like a reputation around the office, like people will already know something about you in the workspace, right? And you might have to, you might take some more extended conversations to know exactly what you do and what your impact is on the business. But that relationship, them knowing who you are and putting yourself out there is super important. So, yeah. So a lot of, I think one of the biggest mistakes for younger people coming into the office is they have like this pedestal for certain people, right? It's like you have your presidents, your vice presidents, your directors. It's like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to bother them, or like I don't want to say something that's I'm gonna fumble my words in front of them. It's like, dude, they're human, and they could sense that right away. It's like if you're being a brown noser or you're just trying to do something because you're trying to get the edge on the rest of your competition, they're going to know that right away. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why they don't like engaging in those conversations initially. So you have to break down those walls and come super kind of like a mixture of like humble, but genuine, and just saying like, hey, like, how was your weekend? Like, what'd you do? And then once you have that conversation, they say, oh, you know what? I had the first question they're going to ask after this holiday is, oh, how was your Thanksgiving? Right. Yeah. And they're going to go into how's the family and whatnot. And then you take one piece of that thing. They said, oh, you know what? My daughter, she recently had a baby. Her baby's, a year old, and I got to spend time with my granddaughter. It was an awesome time. Okay, you data collect, right? So you continue to keep that in your brain. You say, okay, next time I see him, I'm gonna ask him about his granddaughter. And I'm gonna tell you right now, as like a father, and I would say I'm assuming that grandfathers will feel the same way. The kids and their grandchildren are like the most important thing in their life. Like work, 100%. Work is gonna be there, but that's the thing that they love talking about the most, and they're the most prideful. Like I would assume that every man is the most prideful about their family, where they come from, their background, right? So
yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, if you stem it out, if you really break down the motivations of why one is working, it would either be for yourself or for your family. And a lot of family men, if they do mention their family, most likely would be their family. But to that point, that's where you and I always talk about this, and I always share this thing. Whenever I catch myself or my brother just pedestalizing somebody, I just say, look, they poop. We just poop on different toilets. That's a fact. Yeah. Like, you might have a golden toilet. I might have a crappy public one. Yeah. But you and I both poop. You and I will both die. Like, those are actual facts. I don't have to give you statistics on that. That's a 10 out of 10 fact. Yeah. So that's why, for me, I don't really pedestalize people, because if you're a hard worker, everyone knows you're a hard worker. Yeah. If you do your job, I'm not fearing my job to be, at risk. Yeah. But one thing to add to that is you got to also think about what that managing director or what that CEO or whoever that person is, like, think about how that would feel if you've brought yourself to be successful, and the only thing people talk to you about is how you got successful. Or you could just, you could literally smell the brown nosing. Like, it's like, someone's just coming up to you and it sounds super selfish. It just sounds like they have an agenda. Like, how did you get here? How did you get here? How did you like, da-da-da-da? Like, what could I do differently? It's like, bro, first of all, you're not relevant enough for him to even know you.
Yeah.
Sadly. So that's a reality there. The second thing is, that doesn't even sound genuine. Like, would you even go up to your friend or someone that, you respect and just say, hey, what can I do to better my life? You know what I mean? It just comes off very selfish, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's one of my hard rules is like, I mean, in my personal opinion, everyone is created equal. Every man is created equal. You strip everything away from a person, they're a person, right? Like it comes down to the rawness of it, right? It's like, I'm a human being, that person is a human being. Like we probably go through the same struggles. Honestly, I might even be in a better position because I know Christ and he doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can't, like, there's just things that I think is, each person has things that they value. And I think we can't assume that this person is better than us for X, Y, and Z reasons. And the other thing about brown nosing that we don't think about is this person will eventually be meaningless to us if we move to a different company. Right. I used to have that in a previous place where I worked. I used to like have that pedestal of like, people were like, oh my gosh, they're like this. Oh my gosh, they're like that. I want to be like them. And honestly, like even if they treated people like trash, it was like, oh, wow, they're in a glorified position, right? Like they're managing teams of 150, 200 people, and you want to be like that. But at the end of the day, you leave that company, that person's another person to you, you know?
Yeah.
You might not be sitting in the same restaurants, like, because of whatever their social economic level might be different. But at the end of the day, like, hey, you bump into me at the mall, like, hey, you're another person to me, right?
Exactly. And I bench press 3 times more than you.
Yeah, that's right. Like, it's like that meme of Beetlejuice coming around.
You're the CEO because you bench twice more than the CEO. But I would say also another thing to think about. And it's we're kind of going off tangent here, but an important point is that you find something that you deliver high output with the least amount of effort.
Yeah.
I think many people, and I learned this from Naval Ravikant, like he was just saying, why not spend more time figuring out what you want to do in your life and make that a priority rather than just, oh, I'm just doing this because I have to pay the bills, which is important. Yeah. I'm not saying that's not important, but people lack the discipline and care to figure out, okay, like this is what I'm actually good at. This is what I'm not good at. Like, how much are you investing in yourself and doing that discovery versus paying the bills? Because it's crazy to me that if you don't follow that concept, the more effort you're going to put into something because you don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. So if you wake up every single day very unhappy, this is like a telltale sign. If you're waking up very unhappy, you feel like your life is somewhat meaningless and you're depressed and you just like, why am I doing this job, but it's paying the bills? Some people don't have a choice, I understand, but it should still be on your mind as you're going through your job, as you are paying your bills. Are you financially saving so that you could pursue this thing that you actually want to pursue? And everything kind of comes, full circle because like you said, you're self-aware that I have good relationship skills. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that kind of, in my book, would cater towards something more salesy, but you're kind of doing something in between operations, sales. You're in front of customers and things like that. Mm. And if you really think about different ways to drop that level of quote unquote effort, because you're kind of going against what you don't want to do and you're kind of going against your strengths, like really doing that self-discovery and strengths and being self-aware and having people accountable to say, hey, like, Jermz, I know that you're good at relationships. Have you thought about looking at this type of role? Yeah. Or, can you, I've noticed that you are good at X. Like, what here are my suggestions that just out of genuine care. Yeah.
So that's the thing. I think as you have more responsibilities, like if you're responsible for more than yourself, there's a lot more hedging, right? It's like, it's harder for you to start your own business or start something from scratch and really see it through, because you always have this thing in this back of your mind. You're like, oh, well, maybe I should just go to an already established like place because I have to feed my family and, you know, X, Y, and Z. There's a bunch of reasons that you have to, you know, that you kind of almost hedge and say like, oh, this is the reason why I'm here, or giving yourself the reason of why you're there. I battle that all the time. You know, it's like, I mean, if I have managers listening to this podcast, I love my job, but I just want to say like, I understand where you're coming from, and I think it just gets tougher the more you wait. Right.
Yeah.
So for me, if I was 25, I had this motivation mindset where I'm just like, hey, I want to go out and I want to do something. I want to build something for myself. It's easier because you're 25. You're relatively young. You're only responsible for yourself. And, you know, whether you come home late at, 9, 10 o'clock and you wake up at 5 a.m, that's all on you. Like, that's really just kind of all you're responsible for. So taking those risks is good. And I know a lot of podcasters talk about that too. It's like, when I hear advice from like people like Ben Baller, and people will just like come into his podcast and his lives and say like, hey, like, like what would you do in my situation? And he also acknowledges like, yeah, the older you get, the more you have to be conservative with those decisions, or it's going to be harder for you during those times. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It's just going to be harder because you have more responsibilities that you have to think about. So there might be more hedging.
Yeah, but that's another thing. It's harder, but you're wiser. Yeah. So I was talking to the CEO of a company, and he and I had a really good conversation. And he is like, timing is everything. So he was, because I was like, well, what made you drop your 9 to 5 and to say, hey, I'm just going to start my own thing? And he said, well, it was a full year of planning, but I've always knew I was going to start my own thing. I just wasn't ready yet. Yeah. And that's a whole different ball game too, because just because you're 25, 26, that you have a higher risk appetite or potential to do things doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right time. Yeah. Doesn't mean you can't prepare, right? Sure. So what we're trying to, I guess, advise or share is there should be some level of preparedness, or mentally thinking about, outside of just work, is just how could I find something that brings me, self-joy, fulfillment, and all that, and I feel like this is my purpose. Yeah. Or these are my strengths. I feel like I would go against less of my weaknesses so that I could embrace my strengths. So that would be a segment. But on top of that, so we're talking about family, we're talking about responsibilities, we're talking about career, and I just want to share some statistics here and why it's important that we want men to be hyper aware when you're dating too. Is that I did some research in the Bay Area just to have so I'm using Bay Area because that's where I'm from. And so in the Bay Area, if you have a wife and you have a child, the fixed cost net, well, I'm not talking gross, the fixed cost to survive and feed yourself and have a decent apartment and all that is estimated, and it's all online, $93,000 net. So if we do our taxes because we're both from banking, 33% on top of that, let's say that's tax, you add that margin on there. I mean, what are you looking at? Maybe like 120, 130K just to survive, not live lavishly in the Bay Area. Yeah. Now, you could throttle those percentages, but what's important is a lot of these, the average man makes, I think, somewhere along the lines of like $39,000 to $42,000 a year in California. So if one is complaining as a man, if you are complaining that all these women are rejecting you or you're not doing that well, first of all, on a capital perspective and a work perspective and covering fixed cost perspective and a business mindset, right? If my income is $42,000 on average and my fixed costs are $93,000, if I ever plan to, I mean, if you're thinking in a woman's perspective, I'm planning to marry this guy, I'm going to have a kid with this guy, my fixed costs are going to be $93,000, even though I don't know if many people really think about it that way, but that's the reality. And this guy's only bringing in $42,000. How am I going to survive? Because if I quit my job or go on maternity leave or whatever it may be. So a lot of people don't think about that. Like some people are like, oh, a woman just want a guy who makes six figures. Da, da, da. It's like, well, yeah, if I had to give up 6 months after, and then 9 months of pregnancy and whatever it may be, like that's quite a bet to have on someone who's just going to do their 9 to 5 and barely cover the fixed costs. And so I think that's another thing that men have to realize, why being self-motivated, being responsible, and also finding alternative ways of income or increasing your personal asset level to be higher and higher and higher is because we just have high fixed costs.
Yeah. So I feel like I have a very high standard for just men in general. And I'm not saying that I'm in a position where I'm the ideal man or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but I think when we think about men from a biblical perspective, there is just a huge responsibility for us. I think God called us to be leaders, to be at the head of our household. And, you could take that very lightly, but also you could take that very seriously as well. And my belief is that God is actually wanting us to take that very seriously in ways that we could lead our families. And, there's always that controversial verse that says, women be submissive to your husband, or sorry, wives be submissive to your husband. But as we discussed before, that the pressure and the ownership and the responsibility is really on the man, because that verse isn't saying like, hey, wives, do exactly what your husband tells you to do. Don't argue with him. It's not saying that. What it's saying is, men, you have to love your wife like Christ loved the church. And what did Christ do for the church?
He died.
He died for the church.
He died for the church.
And so are you willing to die for your wife, for your family? Are you willing? And die can also mean physically, but also just in terms of yourself and like the things that you want to do, like self-sacrifice. Like, okay, like a few things that I could think about is like the well-being of your family, right? So like this is one example is moving away from your family to be closer to your wife's family because of her well-being, and because of what, like, if you have children, you want to have them closer to their grandparents. Like, even if I wanted to be closer to my friends, I wanted to be closer to people who I have a relationship with. Well, how does this benefit my family? Is this going to make my wife happy? For me, like, her priority should be first, and you should be loving in a way where it's like, hey, you come before me, and I want you to be, feel like I'm leading you in that way too.
Yeah. So that's what the verse says, and no one reads it all the way through. And what Paul is saying is, yes, he does state, wives, submit to your husbands, but it also follows up with, husbands, love your wives.
Yeah.
Right. And what does love mean? Love is patient, love is kind, the whole nine, right? And so if you, and this is for everyone to hear, not gender specific. If a man truly loves his wife and he's demonstrated the ability to be a leader, then of course, I think it would make sense if a wife is willing to submit to the husband. But the problem isn't that women aren't submitting. The problem is men lack the ability to be a strong leader, right, so that a woman could even trust them to the ability that they're even willing or considering to submit.
Yeah.
And myself included, I've messed up a lot in my relationships. I wasn't the best person I could be, and I wouldn't even trust myself. So, like, the reason why it's important that we think about it is, how are you being the best man of God? How are you loving your wife? Like you said, is she top of mind all the time before making a decision? Am I staying physically fit?
Yeah.
Am I doing the best I can at my job?
Yeah.
Am I covering all the fixed costs and busting my tail so that my family's happy?
Yeah. So when you think about love, like the way that I see love, and I think the best picture and moment that I could capture of Christ loving the church is when he's praying with God. I think it's like Gethsemane, or I forget where exactly the location is, but he's praying to God, and God is just showing him the cup that he needs to drink. And imagine like you just having like Christ being there and being like, hey, like, This is something that I don't want to do. Like, he wants to do it for our benefit, but then again, he knows that there's so much pain and suffering for him, right? He's a human being as well, right? So I feel like for him, like he says, like, is there any way that this cup can be taken from me? And then, and he says, well, if this is what I need to do, then I'm going to gladly take it because this is part of your will.
But the suffering wasn't the physical and the mental suffering. The suffering was the fact that he would be apart from God for X amount of days.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but agree to your point. There's suffering that's involved, but the suffering was more along the lines of being separated from God. That was the most impactful. But that's even crazier. Like, he literally sacrificed the one relationship that he didn't want to give up so that the church could be saved.
Right.
And I would highly doubt a lot of husbands are
thinking right.
that
but it should be a reflection of what a man should do for his wife. Yeah, that is the level of intensity, the level of ownership, the level of discipline, the responsibility that every man should take in. Every Christian man should take into their marriage.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So I think that's a very strong point. With all that said, now we're talking about marriage. We're going to take another tangent here, and I love to just bounce different ways. But after that point, we're talking about marriage. But what about the people who are not married, right? Mm-hmm. We were talking about dating a little bit. Let's make this a little bit for those single individuals like myself and a few others. Mm-hmm. I think a few things. I personally think out of the people that I know, Jermz has some pretty good game, quote unquote, because he's just naturally people person, right? Sarah's watching this. Oh, what is that supposed to mean? Well, you're the married one, right? I mean, yeah. Honestly, this is what do you talk to the guy who has the job, or do you talk to the guy who doesn't have the job, right? My brother and my friend have the job, and you know what? They got the best game. So you talk to them and you learn a little bit from them. That's just my philosophy. Yeah. You can't talk to a single. Well, you know what? This is how a married man's supposed to be. It's like, what are you talking about, bro?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of single men struggle with is insecurity. It doesn't have to be in the form of like, I don't look a certain way, or there's something about myself that I don't like. It's just more like the confidence issue, where it's like you have to really get to know who you are yourself before you can ask someone else to like you, right? Like, if you don't like yourself, if you're not happy with yourself, why do you expect someone else to like you, right? Like, there's should be like this thing where you can approach a girl no matter what she says, and even if she's, it's a challenge for you. She's pretty. You feel like she's not in your league. Okay, but like, why does she need to know that? Like, the confidence that you go into, and that's the thing. I mean, when I approach my wife, like, I mean, we talk about our 1 second rule, right? Like,
yep.
Well, one thing is like, we have this rule about speaking things into existence. So if John says, "Hey, this girl's cute," now he's spoken into existence. He's got to go talk to her. And then our another rule is a 1 second rule. It's like, if you say, it's kind of in the same rules. If you think a girl's cute, you have 1 second to go talk to her. And we're implementing this with another friend of ours. It's like, so because once you pass that 1 second, all the doubt, all this other things, that all these excuses start filling your head. Oh, you know what? She's talking to her friend, or she's busy. I think you have all these excuses that fill your brain, and then you start talking yourself out of it. Each second that goes by, you start retreating. Mm-hmm. That 1 second, you got to go talk. You got to just say, hey, just confidently, and just say like, hey, this is who I am, and just spark up a conversation. But also there's a technique to that as well. Like, you can't just be like, hey, I'm John, and just nod your head. I think you have to go with the plan, and you have to be really good about planning on the spot and being very spontaneous. But that's what I've learned.
Stupid. Like, if she's eating ice cream, you eating ice cream? That's crazy. That's stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're one of the good ones at picking up little clues, and then you could like formulate a conversation. Some of my parts that I don't do well is follow up questions, because I think some people, and I know myself, I'm like my hardest critic. And if I feel the vibe of a conversation isn't going the direction I want it to go, sometimes I just kill it and just kind of move on. But I think one thing that you are really good at with people in general, it doesn't have to be the opposite gender. It's just you're just genuinely curious. So it's like, we just came back from a Friendsgiving, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay. Well, what'd you guys have at the Friendsgiving? Is it a potluck?
Yeah.
Is it this? Is it that?
Right.
That comes natural to you. For me, I was like, Friendsgiving? I had Friendsgiving too. Did you drink? I drank a lot. Like,
it's I hate to credit this this group for helping me kind of think through it, but I took my first job was a retail sales job, and I hated the job, but it taught me really good relationship building skills, and it was a sales role. So one thing I learned was like, that was key, was asking open-ended questions, the who, what, when, where, how, because that, instead of a yes or a no, it's going to give you something that you're going to build off of for your next question, right? So like, that's one thing that I'm always like, okay, like you have to also be hyper aware. You got to be paying attention to the conversation so you can pick that up. If your mind's somewhere else, I mean, they talk about in Hitch, like be in the room, when you're talking to this person and you're engaged, then you could pick up on the small things,
Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
and that's why when women, they say, oh, I want a guy who's a good communicator, it's not necessarily the communication or like, oh, we need a driving conversation, is pretty much, are you listening and are you present?
Right.
And are you able to build off of our conversation based off the data points that we're sharing?
Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of men lack that. That's why even when I see and hear from dating apps, oh, I want a guy who's a great communicator. It's like, well, what do you mean? Because they could be a CEO of a company and they know how to present the heck out of it, but they suck in a relationship conversation. So what do you mean by communication? Listening, actively listening, paying attention, asking open-ended questions, like genuinely caring about the other individual.
Yeah. And I think that's where you can exemplify. I mean, this might be going far because not every person in a relationship, wants to take it to the marriage level, but that's a way that you can practice, right? Like, how do you, when you love somebody, when you're talking to them, or if you even like somebody, when you're talking to them, you're really fully engaged because you care about that person, right? And you almost, you have to put them as a priority when you're listening.
Exactly. And so going back to that point where your thesis is, you have 1 second to decide if you want to talk to this person. And then if you wait, there's all the self-doubt. Another way that I train myself to mitigate it is, that's why you got to come prepared. Like if you're not prepared, and what do I mean by prepared? I'm not saying, oh, stalk that girl, like, her life already. Prepared as in, are you mentally prepared for yourself? Are you physically fit? Are you looks maximizing yourself? Are you the man that you say you are? And then you've already have this high level of confidence before walking in and saying something to the girl.
Yeah.
Because you know your value. And if you know your value, then you tend to have a better conversation, because at the end of the day, you're not like, oh, this girl was better, than. And like one of the arguments that we used to have when we were both single is that like, Jeremy was like, well, I can't really talk to white women because, we have this negative stigma and Asian guys and this and that. And it's like, okay, fine. The media says we got, on average, a smaller egg roll or whatever the media says, right? That gives me way more motivation to be that much better. If the world is against you, then you got to go 3 times harder against it.
Yeah.
If I'm known to be less sexually appealing because that's the way media shows me as long duck dong or whatever, like I gotta go out there. I gotta sound way more articulate. I gotta sound way more successful. I gotta looks maximize even more because if media says white men, black men are more physically in shape. Well, I gotta go out there and eat my protein and start pumping it up. Start disproving it. And I've seen more often than not now a lot more Asian Americans are modeling and they're becoming more physically fit. They're in outside of roles that are just martial arts. So I think that's some of the things, if you go against the grain and you suffer through it and you push yourself to that degree, that gives you that extra level of confidence where your ethnicity doesn't define you. You define you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, well, to that point, I think this is a good place for us to stop. And I think we're getting super passionate about dating and just finding confidence in yourself as a man and our self identity. So I think that's a great place to pick up for our next conversation.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, thanks for tuning in, guys.